Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As we finished off last week, we spoke about the logistics and the legal aspects of a Gett. We said that we'll continue and talk about more in depth about the plight and the problem of what's called an Aguna. And today I will dedicate, even though touched upon certain aspects of these painful subjects in the past, but I'll dedicate to this session, even though one can talk about it at great length. So, first of all, we mentioned many times, or at least a number of times in relevant sessions and lectures, that when a Jewish couple, stand under a chuppah and they enter into a marriage, as we say, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and Israel, it creates a most powerful bond that is beyond a ceremony. It's beyond just some kind of a symbolic some symbolism that is part and parcel of many types of celebrants when they try to recreate certain traditional aspects of Jewish marriage. Halachic marriage creates a bond that is so powerful because Hashem himself dictated that this bond is created. And the bond is a divine bond. And the Torah tells us, it's in the first Mishnah in the tractate of Kiddushin, that the only thing that can actually break that bond is one of two things: either the death of one of the spouses or a Gett. And the Gett we spoke about last week. The Gett is something which is not a symbolism, not a ceremony. It's a very legal process that has the halachic power only because God mandated it. The same God who created the bond, he tells us how to be able to break the bond. And Gett is the only thing which can destroy the bond. So without the Gett, if both parties are alive, they continue to be married. And then you have this question of Aguna. What is Aguna? In the times of the sages, in times of Chazal, in the later years when the Shulchan Aruch was written, the usual definition of Aguna was a woman that a husband disappeared. He traveled, either in times of war or in times of peace when communication wasn't as it is today. His whereabouts are not known, or there's no witnesses that he died, and she remains in a limbo. She's on one hand still married. She cannot marry anybody else. On the other hand, she's stuck. She doesn't have a husband on one hand. On the other hand, she's a widow for all purposes. It's called in English a straw widow. There's such a term. And that was a term used for Agunas. And the Aguna, there's a whole section of Talmud dedicated to Agunas. One of the longest sections in Shulchan Aruch and Code of Jewish Law dedicated to which evidence is qualified in order to be able to ascertain the husband's death, and otherwise, she's still married to him, even though there could be some circumstantial evidence. This particular type of Aguna also was in question even in our times. There were certain times when a plane crashed without any remains of a person, and the rabbis had to, the poskim, the authorities had to decide, is there enough evidence halachically to determine that the wife can remarry. In 2001, when this tragic event occurred, September 11th, when the Twin Towers were crashed, and some of the people who were at the time in that place had to jump out of the window, and there was no remains of them. So it was actually a very tragic testimony to what happened. One of the husbands who was trapped when he realized that he will not survive, and I actually heard a recording of his phone conversation with his family. He called up a rabbi in order to be able to verbally authorize to write a Gett in case he knew that his wife may remain an Aguna. To avoid it, he wanted that a Gett should be authorized to be written in order to be able to avoid the status of an Aguna. But in this day and age, when the communication is so profound and so advanced, it's very, very difficult to have an Aguna whose husband just disappeared. It's quite unusual. It happened during Yom Kippur War, it happened in times of disaster, but it's quite unusual. Unfortunately, there's a new definition of an Aguna which became much more famous and much more commonly used. And this is an Aguna, a woman whose husband denies her a Gett. Why is it denying her a Gett? It could be for many reasons. Usually you can sum it up for reasons of exerting power over her. It could be revenge, it could be extortion, it could be blackmail, many different reasons. None of them are justifiable. But without a Gett, and without the husband actually cooperating to give a Gett, she remains married. And that's something which is asked many times by members of the community. How is it possible that the Torah creates a law that the husband can have such power over his wife that he can choose not to grant her a Gett? Again, the question would be a legitimate question if Torah would be made by humans. But ultimately, the basis of everything that we talk about every single week is that the Torah is a divine law, a divine system, a divine wisdom, and the rabbis are given the authority and the permission to be able to use the knowledge to be able to find solutions to complicated questions, but they can't change the law. We didn't make the law to change it, and therefore all we can do is find ways out of difficult situations. But the question, why did it happen this way? It could be a different discussion. We spoke about it already once. Ultimately, even though being faithful in marriage is important for men and for women, and there's no justification for either party to be unfaithful, but ultimately in the Ten Commandments, when the commandment number 8, leisinaf, of committing adultery, that specifically applies having relations with a married woman, which is a adultery for both the man who's having relations with her and for her. So if a woman didn't have a Gett, the consequences are very harsh. She remains a married woman. If she has relations with any other men, she violates one of the Ten Commandments, which is one of the most severe transgressions. And if she has a child with a Jewish man, the child is a mamzer, is an illegitimate child. It's true, we must be honest, that we have plenty of problems with agunas, with ladies that are struggling to get a Gett, and I'll talk in a minute what we do to assist them and to help them. But it's also, for fairness' sake, we must say that we have an equal amount of men who also are stuck in a marriage and the wives are refusing to accept a Gett. Because as I mentioned in the previous lecture, in the 11th century, a Rabbeinu Gershon, he made many legislations. One of them was against bigamy and polygamy, that a man also can only be married to one woman, number one. And number two, he said, and something which was accepted by all streams of Judaism, that a woman also has to willingly accept a Gett. She cannot be handed a Gett against her will. And therefore, today we also have a situation when a husband comes and says, I want to have a Gett, and I'm dealing with a few such cases as we speak. And the wife says, no, I don't want to accept the Gett from him. And it's also not a simple matter. And I would say that in numbers, we have 50-50. 50% of women struggling to get a Gett, and men who are struggling to be able to have their wives accept the Gett. Before we'll talk about possible solutions, I want to say that a number of years ago, there was a very public case that went viral on social media about a very prominent member from a rabbinical family that was refusing to give a get to his wife. And at that time, I was asked by the community to comment on it because there was a lot of very justifiable outcry against it. How is it possible that this man is holding his wife in ransom, hostage, and doesn't allow her to get on with her life when the marriage broke down irreversibly? And at the time I wrote an article, which was published in the social media. And in that article, on one hand, I've explained why a marriage, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and Israel, as we say, according to Jewish law, is such a powerful bond that can only be broken in a very specific way. And that's something which God himself mandated, on one hand. On the other hand, how we do find that in every single institution, there are people who abuse that institution. And the fault is within those people, the abusers, not within the institution itself. So the same way as we wouldn't blame, for example, if there's a parent who abuses the child, we wouldn't blame the institution of parenthood. We wouldn't say you have to abolish parenthood. Or if you have, for example, an institution of a teacher, and the teacher abuses the pupil, a doctor abuses a patient, which happens many times. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the institution. It means that, unfortunately, in every single institution, you have people that abuse their power, abuse the influence, abuse the position, and that's something which can be tolerated, but we should blame the actual perpetrators and not the system itself. And especially we talk about Judaism, which is we believe it's a divine truth, it's absolute truth, and it's a wisdom and will of God himself. So therefore, we have to do everything possible to eradicate that sort of behavior, but not try to be able to put the blame on the Torah itself. Another point which I want to make is that when it comes to outcries and different suggestions how to be able to alleviate the plight of Agunas, we have to know that many of the Agunas are religious women who want to be helped only according to Halacha, only according to Jewish law. So if you will find them a seeming solution that may placate the sympathizer, the one that is trying to offer help, but the solution is not halachic, it's not going to help the woman. First of all, it won't help them because they are looking for a halachic solution, and it's not going to change the position and change the status. So when we're going to discuss some of these methods, we'll talk about solutions which are suggested, which can actually help, and some of them cannot help. So we have a situation of men and women who are refusing to give or accept a get. When it comes to men, if we are intellectually honest, we have to admit that there are more solutions to assist the men. Not because we're being male chauvinists, God forbid. On the contrary, we'll show also the other side, that sometimes we try very hard, even more on the side of the woman. But because biblically, there are more solutions. Biblically, a man is allowed to marry more than one wife, and it's only prohibited by later legislation. And therefore, there are certain mechanisms put in place which allow, in an extreme situation, the man to be able to leave the chains of marriage that he doesn't want to be in. Those two solutions are mainly either what we call get zikui, which means sometimes to be able to give a get ex parte, in other words, unilaterally without the woman's participation. It can be done in a very, very few cases, which I'll explain in a minute. And the other one is called Heter Rabbanim, which means to be able to apply a very complicated mechanism of a permission granted by 100 rabbis over 3 continents. The first concept of a zikui comes from a Talmudic teaching that when it comes to a liability, you cannot impose a liability on a person without their agreement. You can never do that. When it comes to a merit, you can merit somebody even without the knowledge. That is the reason when we spoke about conversion of minors, for example. When we take a child who he can't accept mitzvahs and he doesn't have enough knowledge or maturity to be able to want to be Jewish. But when his parents are converting, we can also convert or if parents want to adopt a child, and we know that he's going to grow up in a very loving, beautiful Jewish home, that's considered for him to be a merit at that particular point of his life. And therefore one is allowed to convert a child from that particular principle of Mezakin Le'odam Shelo B'Fondav. You can give a person a merit even ex parte without their agreement. So in a situation when a woman chose to get on with her life and she is living with another man, not just casually, we have to know, we have to have proof, we have to have witnesses for that, and she is either married or either a Jew or a non-Jew, or she's having a partner, then we can do a get ex parte without her permission, because it's chus for her. She is violating one of the 10 Commandments every single day of her life, living with the other men. And we apply a special mechanism where when we have an agent who will accept a get on her behalf through the principle of zikui, of merit. We're also very discretionary when we do that. We don't do it every single time that a woman doesn't want to accept a get, because sometimes she has a very good reason why she not that she doesn't want to accept the get, but she feels vulnerable. She feels that she'll be neglected, that certain responsibilities will not be able to be given to her, that come to her. For example, one particular case that we had quite a number of years ago, when there was a woman who agreed to accept a get from her husband, but at the last minute she never showed up, and we did the first part of the get through an agent, which still is not finished. As I explained last week, the agent still has to be able to give a get to the woman until the get comes into her hands. She's not divorced. And we asked her why she never showed up. She said because the husband is supposed to, they spoke about tuition for kids. The kids are going to expensive Jewish private school, and the husband doesn't even want to discuss it. It's not a question of that she wants to impose anything or force him into anything. She just wants the normal responsibility of a father towards his children, to sit down and to be able to have some conversation, give and take, and to decide, how they're going to share the responsibility. But he felt that he doesn't even want to come and talk about it. And we thought that she had a very good point. She wasn't trying to be vindictive or trying to impose control over him. She wanted to be able to have some kind of a leverage, to be able to not to be left without any means to give her kids education. And ultimately, he went overseas to have to get married in Europe, and he kept on calling me to ask him what's happening with the get. And I told him that all you have to do is just sit down, and she'll accept the get right away. A few days before his wedding, the rabbi in that city in Europe called me up and said, "What do we do? There's a hall, there is a catering, everything is booked, and there's no get." So, and he said that he heard from another rabbi in Europe that sometimes you might be able to do a zikui, a get through this principle of merit, because she was the one who initiated the civil divorce. And once she initiated the civil divorce, she shows that she wants to get. And once she shows the get, it means that's something that is a merit for her, not a liability. And I said to him that in principle he's correct, and we could sometimes put forward that particular principle in a situation when she was the one that actually asked for civil divorce. But in this particular case, she has a very good reason why she wants to wait a bit. And all he had to do is just come to the party as far as discussion is concerned. She had no particular expectation from him of any particular amount, just a normal human conversation. And therefore, I think that she has the right to wait with the get, and that's what happened. As soon as the wedding did not take place, at least I don't know if the party took place, but there was no Jewish chuppah. And when he came home to Sydney, he realized that he has to be able to cooperate. And after one meeting with her, she came to Besdin and she was granted the get. The Heter Rabbanim, which is the other one, when it comes to zikui, when it comes to a get given to a woman through the principles of merit, she still if she wants to get married, she still has to come to Besdin and pick up the get, because that's the ultimate way of receiving the get. But with the zikui, they consider to be divorced in principle. That is why, if she's living with somebody else, it's not considered adultery. With the Heter Meah Rabbanim, when it comes to permission of 100 rabbis, it becomes more complicated. Because they're still married, And Rabbeinu Gershon, who was a rabbi who lived in Europe in the 11th century, as much as he created legislation to prohibit bigamy and polygamy, and he prohibited it very strictly. It's still applicable today, and it's still a very, very strict legislation. However, he also knew that sometimes there will be certain extreme circumstances, and therefore, if those circumstances would happen to a woman, no rabbi would have the right to find a solution which of 100 rabbis, because the prohibition for a woman to marry a second husband while she's married to the first one or to be with another man. She can be married because, as I mentioned to you in the very first lecture, when it comes to that level of prohibition, the marriage doesn't even kick in. So it's a question of she's prohibited from being with another man. That's something which is biblical. It's something which is no rabbi can make a dispensation. But when it came to a situation of bigamy, when it comes to a very extreme circumstances, for example, when the wife just completely vindictive, she has no desire. We had a couple of such cases. She had no desire for the Beth Din to be able to lobby on her behalf about something, to be able to implement something for her benefit. She just wanted to make her husband's life miserable, or in a situation where she completely disappears, or where she becomes a vegetable. In these cases, he can initiate the process of Heter Rabbanim, where he can, after having this, and it takes a while, it doesn't take one day, because you have to be able to write a legal Halachic responsum, which means a thesis, to be able to show why, in this particular case, it's applicable. And then you have to be able to get a agreement of a major Beth Din outside of the country. We usually work together with the High Court and the High Beth Din in Jerusalem. And afterwards, once you have their agreement, you get 100 signatures from 3 continents. So we'll get, for example, 40 signatures from Israel. It has to be rabbis who understand what's going on, and so on and so forth, and a certain amount from America, a certain amount from Australia. And when you get 100, and you still have to have a get in a Beth Din, because you can't have a situation where the husband will be permitted to marry another wife, and then after his wife will come and she'll change her mind, she'll want to get a get, he'll decide to take revenge and say, I'm not going to give you a get. So to avoid it, the get has to the get is written, it's held within the Beth Din, and any time that his wife decides to accept it, she'll come to Beth Din, she'll accept it without any questions. There is a very, very sad case that is happening right now in America, which I was privy to because I was at one point asked by a Beth Din on the West Coast about logistics of doing a get. There is a very, very I would say unethical individual who lives in America, who is already holding his wife hostage for many, many years. Somehow, I don't know who helped him to do it, he was able to marry a second wife. He goes in public media and he tells everybody that it's all lies, and he's prepared to give a get. The get isn't a Beth Din, but I know that there is that he has a high price that she has to pay, both monetary and to do with custody of children, which is making it impossible for her to be able to come and to accept the get because she won't agree to those conditions. At one point, when his mother died and she was buried in Israel, the rabbinate withheld, they tried to postpone the burial until he will give the get. And at that time I was contacted by a Beth Din in California that were going to write the get, and they asked me how to do it in a way that because he knew every trick in the book. He knew how to be able to authorize a get and then to be able to nullify it. So how to do it, not to allow him that particular possibility. But at the end, unfortunately, something happened, and the burial took place, and the woman is still in Aguna. But those are some of the ways, and the reason why I mention this case is because I can't understand how it's possible to be able to get permission for men to marry another wife, and at the same time to deny his wife a get. That's something which is beyond me, and it shouldn't happen. But those are the few solutions that can happen to be able to assist a husband. When it comes to a woman who is denied a get, possibilities are a little bit more complicated. First of all, we know that to forcing a get from a husband is also not so simple, because literally, for example, to take a husband and torture him, not that it's allowed, but if today somebody would do it and he would give a get, most of the time the get would not be kosher, because the get has to be given voluntary of his own free will. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned last week, many mechanisms are made during the actual get procedure to make sure that we know that was done of the husband's free will, and the wife's also. She also has to say it's done of her own free will. So different mechanisms which are used to force the husband, one has to tread very carefully to make sure that ultimately it's done according to Jewish law. Nobody should be able to question the get later on. In Israel, where the Beth Din has the power from very beginning of the state of Israel, Ben Gurion understood that even though the population of Israel comprises of both secular and religious, when it comes to most important things like conversion, marriage, and divorce, which, if not unified, will splinter the nation into two. So he understood that if he will not implement only one standard of conversion, one standard of marriage, one standard of divorce, it will not be beneficial to anybody, neither to religious, even more to the secular, because it'll create a rift and a barrier between them. And therefore, in Israel, when it comes to marriage and divorce, it's in the hands of the rabbinate. And the rabbinate puts a lot of effort to be able to make sure that there's no agunahs and to put pressure on the husband to give a get. But again, they have to go in a certain gradual level in order that it shouldn't be that they already using the highest level of force before it's mandated. So for example, in the beginning, they will confiscate a husband's passport. They will not allow him to go overseas. And they will implement certain other sanctions. And only as a very, very extreme situation, they can put the husband into prison. And that's something which is done sometimes also. Again, it's not an ultimate solution, because in theory you could have a husband that would rather be in jail than give a get to his wife. But in most cases that they are successful eventually to be able to succeed. There was a case, a very prominent case that happened a few years ago in America. There was a certain Beth Din that used to take law into their own hands, and whenever they would have a case of a husband who refused to give a get to his wife, they would do whatever they can to make sure he gives the get. When it was impossible, they would actually use physical force to be able to get him to give a get. And this went for a number of years, until a few years ago, the FBI actually created an ambush that they had the people who pretended to be a husband and a wife, and the wife is being refused a get from a husband, and they basically made a time to meet with the husband somewhere in out of town, in New York or New Jersey, somewhere there, and they were going to actually use physical force to be able to get the husband to give a get, but they didn't realize there was an FBI ambush and there was a raid, and all were arrested, and some of them are actually sitting in jail till today, unfortunately. Now, I have my own reason why, apart from the fact that it's illegal to be able to do what they've done, but even from a purely Jewish perspective, I have my doubts, because when it comes to actual physical force, there has to be a proper protocol to be able to allow that. In other words, to allow, to be able to rule that in this particular case, one can actually force the husband to give a get. And I mentioned last week that it's only or a couple of weeks ago, it's only in the very extreme circumstances the Torah itself mandates that you hit him until he says, I want to give a get. And I explained to you, if you remember, one of the lessons, that how the Maimonides explains that at that point when the Torah itself mandates that he's obligated to give a get, then when he says, I want to do it, then we actually assume that every Jew wants to do what the Torah wants. So, obviously, we don't kidnap husbands and we don't use physical force on them. So, what pressure do we use to be able to try to make sure that there are no agunas, or as little as possible? So one of the ways is sanctions. To be able to publicize the fact that the husband is not giving a get. Today, every shul will cooperate and will not give the husband any kind of honors to be called up to the Torah, to open the ark. If the Beth Din will say that this husband is actually refusing his wife a get for no good reason, it'll be something which there'll be a full cooperation of all the shuls. We had once a case a number of years ago when we tried very hard to convince the husband to give a get, and finally when we saw that he wasn't refusing but he was always procrastinating, came to a certain point, we gave him until the civil divorce will go into place, because it's difficult to be able to put through sanctions until such time. And ultimately, when the civil divorce came and he still refused to give a get, we publicized in all of the local media, the community, and the synagogues, and everybody cooperated. And within 2 weeks, he came and he gave the get. That's one way. Another way that there was much discussion in later years is to create a prenuptial agreement that will be approved by the rabbinic establishment, by Halachic establishment, and to make sure that you maximize the chances that if the marriage dissolves, there won't be a refusal to give a get. Again, the reason why it has to be done with a lot of caution, because if you would just write in the agreement that if after the marriage dissolves the husband will not give a get, he'll be he's committing a criminal offense, and so on and so forth, and he's forced to give a get, it may be a question of a get me'usa, of a get which was forced and therefore not kosher. And the one that specifically is a particular prenup that is at the moment the most conducive to help solve the problem, and it's something which was in the beginning initiated by an organization in America called RCA, or the Beth Din of America, which is one of the major Beth Dins in America. And the concept, I myself, together with a colleague in Argentina who worked very, very hard to perfect this particular prenup. And about 5 years ago, I spoke at a symposium in Manhattan. I traveled to the wedding of my son. And the Monday before, there was a very big symposium in Manhattan with lawyers and psychologists and rabbis and so on and so forth. And I presented that particular perfected type of a prenup that could work. And I believe that from a substantial point of view, this prenup has very, very little problems halachically, and I don't see how it could present a problem. There are certain rabbis who are opposed to any form of prenup. Why? Because they feel that once young couples begin to sign a prenup before they get married, it already puts into the mind a concept of a divorce. The reason why I disagree with this particular position is because, first of all, the kesuba, which is the regular marriage document that every single Jewish couple has, it's also a little bit of a prenup. It also talks about both responsibilities of the husband to his wife during marriage, but also the obligations, including financial obligations, after the marriage dissolves, whether because of death or because of divorce. And because nobody knows the kesuba written in Aramaic, people, they put it in the frame, they hang it up on the wall, it looks like a romantic document. Nothing could be further from being romantic. The kesuba is a very, very legalistic document. But because everybody has a kesuba, you cannot marry without a kesuba, there's no stigma behind it. And the same thing over here, if there will become a time when the prenup will be accepted by everybody, it won't anymore be even a thought of a divorce once they're getting married. The idea of this prenup is that if the marriage dissolves, the husband continues to pay alimony. It doesn't mention the word divorce, and it doesn't mention divorce, any kind of monetary fines. It talks about actual alimony. It's called in Hebrew mezonot or mezonot, which is anyway an obligation of the husband to support his wife. So, and the amount is reasonable. It's not, paying $100,000 a day. We're not talking about some unreasonable, crazy amount that nobody will be able to pay, and the courts will say either you pay up, you have to give a divorce. We're talking about, let's say, a few $100 a day, which is small enough to be able to afford it and big enough to feel the pinch if you pay it every day. And the main benefit of such a prenup is that in a situation where the marriage dissolves and the husband knows that every single day that passes he has to pay this amount of money, it'll push him to go to the Beis Din. And once it comes to Beis Din, it'll be much easier to work with him. So in America, it's already started to be used in certain circles. And we're working both in America and in Australia. In Australia, working with a particular lawyer from Melbourne who says that there are certain legal problems with that particular prenup. In Australia and America, it seems to be much easier. But hopefully, if we'll be able to achieve that particular mechanism, it'll be able to reduce the amount of agunas by a lot. There's a lot more we can say. We'll have some questions now.
All right, just going to mention again, if you would like to submit a question to ask the rabbi, you can send to me privately on chat here on Zoom. So we have one question, which is actually a follow-up question from, I believe, from the first episode, when we spoke about DNA, specifically the mitochondrial DNA.
Right.
So the question is as follows. In regards to your shir on mitochondrial DNA, I saw an article that discusses that there are exceptions where fathers pass on the mitochondrial DNA. Would this change your halachic ruling? Also, I saw another article that a person who has defected mitochondrial DNA can separate the regular DNA and implant it into another egg, making the possibility of having 3 mothers. 1, the DNA donor, 2, the egg donor, and 3, the surrogate mother. What would Halacha say about this?
Okay, so those are 2 very distinct questions. The first question, the main premise of mitochondrial DNA, why it could be used to a certain extent, again, only to a certain extent, in order to help to determine, to certify Jewish status, and we discussed at great length when and how it could be used in the very, very first lecture. The main premise is that the usual DNA that we have, whenever people go on all of these different types of genetic websites, they're completely inadmissible in halacha, because all of us are products of our parents, father and mother. The minute that the egg is fertilized and becomes an embryo, it has a DNA of both the father and the mother has a DNA of her father and the mother, and therefore the final result, when somebody has a certain percentage of being Jewish, it has no basis in halacha, and does not say you could be only 40% Jewish general DNA, you could be fully Jewish, and you couldn't have technically 80% or 90% of Jewish DNA, you could be non-Jewish, because it could be one maternal ancestor who is not Jewish, and halachically you're not Jewish. So mitochondrial DNA is built on a premise that there is a very minuscule part of the egg, which is, the whole egg is the largest cell in the body, has about 3.5 billion letters of DNA, and mitochondria has only 16,500 letters of DNA, so it's very minuscule. But the mitochondria is passed from the mother to sons and daughters, but it will only go further from the daughters. It can't go from males, because with males it self-destructs. So therefore, when you when you test the mitochondrial DNA, you're only looking on the mother side. The fathers are ignored. And what the gentleman or the person who asked the question, what he's asking is, there was one particular article, one particular research that claimed that there is sometimes a certain influence of the male DNA which also sips into mitochondria. And will that now change everything I spoke about? So the answer is that, first of all, it happens extremely, extremely seldom. It's a very rare phenomenon which results from a sickness. That sometimes there could be a certain mutation, distortion, when the father's DNA can sometimes distort mitochondrial DNA. It's not that it becomes now his DNA. It means that his DNA can sometimes come and create interference. But apart from the fact that it's extremely, extremely rare and seldom, it will also never ever result in us certifying somebody who is not Jewish as a Jew. At the very, very most, what it can do, we can sometimes lose the clarity and not know exactly that the person is Jewish when, and we won't certify them because we won't know because the DNA was distorted. But we'll never ever make a mistake by certifying the wrong person. And ultimately we have to know, and I say to many people who, since my lecture, a lot of people tested for DNA and we had some good results and some not such good results. But ultimately I always explain that the possibility to have this mitochondrial DNA assist us is only in very limited cases. And people shouldn't feel that a lot of times people putting all the hopes on it. And you can find many times people who are fully Jewish, 100% Jewish, and the DNA comes out not Jewish at all, because all they had to have is one lady 2,000 years ago, when there was a huge amount of converts in the times of the Second Temple that converted and became his ancestor, and the whole DNA would not be Jewish. So that's something which it would not in any way distort. That's the answer to it won't distort it will not make us make a mistake and certify the wrong person. That's the answer to the first question. The second part of the question was, and something which I think I did mention when I discussed the polemic of having two mothers, two women who are partners in creating a child. One woman gives her DNA, she's the egg donor, and the other one is the birth mother, the surrogate mother. And we spoke at length who is the real mother. And I mentioned that there's really now a possibility of really having three mothers instead of two. And it became actually legal in England. I think it's one of the few places in the world where they allow it. And what they do is that sometimes a woman would like to have her own DNA to create her child, because she wants to feel that she wants to be a genetic mother to her child. But at the same time, she has certain genetic diseases that are, for whatever reason, contained to a very large extent in the mitochondrial DNA. So she said, you know what, we'll divide. We'll take the mitochondria from somebody else, and I use the main egg for myself, and we'll create a child. So I mentioned this, by the way, and I mentioned very briefly. First of all, it's not yet practical, this particular question. It happened only a number of times in England, but it's still a valid question because, first of all, it's already been done a few times in England. I don't know if any Jewish people went through it, but it's something, once it's already done, it's a possibility. And even though a number of rabbis have spoken out and they posed that one should ignore the mitochondrial DNA and concentrate on the main one because the other one is so minuscule, I wanted to reserve my final opinion to think it through a bit further, and I didn't want to yet come to any conclusions about it. I would rather be on the side of caution and still say that one has to be careful not to ignore the mother with mitochondrial DNA, and if the worst comes to the worst, to be able to put the child into mikveh, which was a bit of what is not going to hurt the child, and this will alleviate any doubt. I still think that there should be some kind of always eliminate and alleviate any level of doubt.
All right, so a question from today's lecture. Is the idea to make that form of prenuptial agreement standard amongst all marriages from ultra-Orthodox through to modern Orthodox so it becomes accepted?
I would say that with the ideal. It's something which I'm hoping will happen. Last week, the Jewish world suffered a terrible, terrible loss with the passing of one of the greatest sages of our time, with whom I had the privilege to be very close over the years. His name is Rabbi Zalman Goldberg, and with whom I always discussed when I came to Israel. I went to visit him, and also in correspondence and over telephone, many of the questions that we speak about. He was a person that a lecture should be dedicated to him, because there was nobody of his stature, I believe, in our generation. And he signed on the prenuptial agreement that Rabbi Fegelstock, together with myself, put forward. He actually wrote that he thinks that it's halachic completely valid, and he would like to see that eventually should become a standard for all couples before they get married to be able to sign this prenuptial agreement. He was one of the people, the few others who agreed with it, Rabbi Amar, Rabbi Boaron, Rabbi Oshevais, who also agreed with it. So ultimately, I think it will be of great benefit. But I do believe that there will be still a number of rabbis and members of certain communities that will be resisting that particular innovation. But ultimately, I think it's something we have to try to work at. And the more people that will sign it, the less cases of agunas you will have.
Okay, next question. Someone is saying like this: Hi, I am a family lawyer and also involved with Unchain My Heart in Melbourne. The halachic prenup is not enforceable in the Australian courts. Do you have any comment about this?
Yeah, I mentioned it just a few minutes ago. I said that we are working with the Australian lawyer who says at the moment it's not enforceable, and I don't know. I'll have to be able to speak to that lawyer, and we have to break our head to see what can be done. But I think I did mention in today's lecture that in America it is already enforceable, at least in many states, but not in Australia. It's something that I would like to talk to the lawyer, ask the question, to be able to discuss it further.
All right, and they actually have a second question. They say that refusal of a get can be a ground for an AVO. Are you aware of it, of being used as such in Sydney? And in Israel recently a Beis Din refused a get even though the woman was a victim of family violence. Their ground was that she wasn't frightened enough. Do you have any comments?
It's very difficult to make a comment about it. Doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound good, but it's very hard to make a comment without really hearing all the details. I'm open to hear details, and I'm not shy to criticize if I believe that something wrong was done, but I always like to hear details before I will make an official comment. I do know that in Victoria, a refusal to give a get is becoming to be considered as a form of abuse, and I don't believe it's the case in Sydney yet. I'm hoping that it will happen, but I just now heard that they're moving towards this particular decision in California, which I was happy to hear. But in Sydney, I don't think it happened yet, unfortunately.
All right, someone's asking like this: why was Aguna not accounted for in the original construct? Meaning, why weren't we given the capacity to leave a marriage? Why weren't women given the capacity to leave a marriage?
I can't answer the question. It's again, if it was something made by rabbis, it's one thing, but this was not something made. There are certain challenges that the Torah gives to the Jewish people to be able to, I suppose, to be able to see how they should, to give them the freedom of choice to overcome certain actions, certain types of behavior, and at the same time, the discretion and prerogative for the rabbis to look for innovative and, on the other hand, halachic ways and means to be able to combat situations where the perpetrators are still behaving in this unethical way. So I think there's a challenge on both sides, but ultimately we have to solve it in a halachic manner. I'll give you an example. That there was in every single case that I have worked on, and I'm hoping to soon to come out with a book of approximately 70 something cases picked out of interesting cases that I had to work on over the years. Some of it's only part of them, but one of the rules that I've made was that every single case has to be in writing. So, for example, when the rabbi is asked questions in Jewish law, you can be asked on many different topics. People call me up with laws of kosher and Shabbos and family purity, and most of the questions that people ask me, I would answer them over the phone or sometimes over text, depending on the nature of the question. A lot of times when you have to hear more details, it's not wise just to answer on text without having conversation. But ultimately, it's okay to be able to answer most of the questions over the telephone, because people have to live their lives, and if every time that they have daily questions, you have to start writing theses, it's not doable. There's one exception, and the exception is this area which we're discussing, which is Even Ezer, which talks about the future of the Jewish people, basically the family law, statuses, and so on and so forth. And now this, I made myself a rule from the very beginning. Number one, that every such question which affects the status and the yichus, the halachic position of Jewish people, and certain results and consequences of different problems, I will always put it in writing. I always write it as a tshuva, as a response, and I will always get, depending on how controversial, how difficult the case is, a minimum of 2 other poskim that I respect to be able to co-sign with me and to agree with me on that. Sometimes they would do just with a small statement, sometimes they'll write a whole thesis back to me. And in the book I will quote all of the other agreements that all of the rabbis that have wrote to me in reaction to what I've written about a particular case. And one of the reasons why it's so important, apart from the fact that these cases are that there's an extra weight and responsibility when you rule in such cases, but another practical reason is that you are helping when questions are answered in a very flippant way. Sometimes you're not doing any service to the person that you're helping because you've answered the question. I've seen many times that rabbis will do that, would do it over the phone. Sometimes they'll miss very important points and afterwards say, okay, I didn't realize that, I take it back. When you do things properly and you write everything down, you can't make such mistakes. And also when it'll avoid cases being challenged, because once you go through proper due process, it's harder to challenge such a case. So there was a case in the United States of America where a woman she went through a challenging time receiving a get from her husband, and 2 rabbis have granted her permission to be able to marry without a get. How is it done? It's done. It's very out of all of the cases to be able to find solution for kohen or for mamzer. Out of all the cases, the most difficult and severe cases are allowing a woman to live the marriage without a get. I worked on such a case last year, and it'll be also part of the book. And the case was when we managed to. It also wasn't simple, because you have to, when it comes to that sort of decision, you have to go through proper testimony and not just hearsay. So we had a woman came to our Beth Din, and she said her husband refusing to give her get. It was also part control to do with property settlement. And in the beginning it was very, I thought, oh no, another case of Aguna. But when I heard that a particular rabbi conducted a wedding, I knew there's a solution to the problem, because he's known not to have kosher witnesses, that particular rabbi, that it's aesthetically looks like an Orthodox wedding, but it lacks certain most important halachic parameters to make it valid. And I started a case. It took me literally 8 months to complete it. I've got photos, and I've received a videotape from the actual ceremony, which was on a private beach. Every single guest who came, not only the witnesses that were actually chosen to sign the ksuba and to be under the chuppah, but every other guest, because according to there's a difference of opinions of whether or not other, even if you disqualify the actual chosen witnesses, whether you can still have other kosher witnesses that could make the marriage valid. And ultimately, after in order to disqualify the witnesses, we had to get proper testimony in the Beis Din, and it took time. It was months and months and months of work. And finally, when we did it, I got approximately 8 or 9 agreements from Poskim and Eretz Yisrael to co-sign with me. That's how much work went into it. And this was a easy case than the other one, because the other one didn't have disqualified witnesses. So they, these 2 rabbis in America, they've allowed her to remarry. And after she remarried, based on their dispensation, on the agreement, there was a lot of disagreement among scholars all around the world. And when the pressure became, more severe, they've pulled back the psak, the ruling, and the poor lady is stuck. She married because of their ruling, and now they're pulling back the ruling, which ostensibly what it's saying is that now you're a married woman living, basically an adulterous relationship, and if you have children, they will have a status of being a mamzer. And it can happen, if you do something, you have to do it in a way that's going to work. So any kind of a solution that is going to work, it has to be able to ultimately help the people, and not to be able to just to put something in right, give some kind of a very, very weak ruling that ultimately will challenge and will not do anybody any favors. But it is you can't deny the fact that it's a major problem, and I do accept it. And I think that's a challenge that Hashem has given us, to be able to work on it and to find halachic solutions. But there had to be something that the halacha does agree with, and that the rabbinic establishment does agree with, or at least that you can't always have everybody agree, but at least a significant element within the rabbinical establishment.
All right, we have one final question. Following up on the mitochondrial DNA, can you tell by looking at the mitochondrial DNA when there is an exception where it was passed through the father? And the second part of the question is, wouldn't mitochondrial DNA be considered davar hamemid?
First of all, again, it's not a question of being passed through the father. The father cannot pass mitochondrial DNA. Sometimes, in very rare cases, we're talking about, not 1 in 10, but it's a very, very small percentage. It can sometimes cause a certain mutation or distortion with the general DNA. And again, the most that will happen is that you will say, look, it's not conclusive, but you will never ever make a mistake of certifying somebody. Anyway, whenever you certify somebody through DNA, it's never on its own merits. It's always with something else. And for reasons, I wouldn't compare it to davar hamemid. Definitely not. It's a technical halachic term, which I can explain to the person who's asking the question, but it's not davar hamemid. There were a number of questions that I wanted to answer. I just saw them today that came through, and I God will answer them in the following weeks. And the reason why I didn't want to answer it today, because it's just not enough time. One of them was to something that I spoke about, a very complicated case of mamzerus, of illegitimacy. And they wanted to know the follow-up, what actually happened in the end. And before I would answer the question, because in my memory I have a certain answer, but I wanted to just double check with the judge in Israel that dealt with the case to make sure that I will not make a mistake. And that is the reason I'm not ignoring the one who asked the question, but I want to be able to do proper research, because it's not just a question in halacha, it's a factual question, historical question, what actually happened. And that I want to be able to look into. Ladies and gentlemen, there was another question also that all the questions will be, God willing, dealt with at a certain point. But thank you very much, and have a very good night and a good week, and we'll see you very soon. All the very best.